In the final year of World War II, the United States thought it had seen every form of Axis aggression, from kamikaze attacks in the Pacific to V-2 rockets over London. But in late 1944, a new and terrifying threat began falling from the sky without warning. They didn't come with the roar of engines or the shadow of wings. They came silently, drifting on the upper winds, crossing the Pacific from Japan aboard nothing more than paper and hydrogen. These were the Fugo balloon bombs, and their simplicity made them even more dangerous. The Japanese military believed that by using the jet stream, they could deliver explosives directly to American soil without ever leaving Japan. It was the world's first intercontinental bombing campaign, and no radar, no spotter, no pilot could stop it. These balloons were deceptively delicate in appearance. Made from rice paper and potato paste, they spanned over 10 meters in diameter and were filled with hydrogen gas. But underneath this fragile exterior hung a steel framework holding multiple incendiary bombs and one high-explosive anti-personnel device. Each Fugo balloon was designed to ascend into the stratosphere, ride the jet stream at altitudes of 30,000 feet, and then slowly descend over the North American continent. They were engineered with barometric switches and timed fuses to drop their deadly payloads at precise intervals. The intent was clear: cause forest fires, ignite panic, and prove that Japan could strike the American mainland without ever sending a soldier. The Japanese launched more than 9,000 of these silent bombs between November 1944 and April 1945. Of those, around 300 were confirmed to have made landfall in the United States, scattered across states like Oregon, California, Washington, and even as far as Michigan. Yet due to wartime censorship and classified reports, most of the American public never heard about them. The U.S. government feared that publicity would encourage the Japanese to intensify the campaign. So every recovery was quietly documented, every explosion carefully investigated, but publicly denied or downplayed. What the public didn't know was that the enemy had already broken through the homeland's invisible shield. The technical brilliance behind the Fugo project was equal parts innovation and desperation. Japan lacked the resources to build a massive long-range bombing fleet, but it did have an understanding of high-altitude winds, a secret weapon in itself. The balloons were constructed in schools, temples, and hidden workshops by teenage girls and older workers conscripted for the war effort. With tight coordination and secrecy, Japan had weaponized something previously thought uncontrollable: the sky itself. To the American military, the idea of paper bombs drifting 6,000 miles sounded ridiculous until they started finding craters, scorched earth, and bomb fragments in remote forests and farmland. On May 5, 1945, one of these balloons succeeded in a way Japan had hoped for, but at a terrible cost. In the forests near Bly, Oregon, a group of children and a local pastor's wife came across a strange balloon remnant lodged in the trees. Unaware of the danger, they approached the object just as one of the bombs detonated. The explosion killed all 6 of them instantly, the only known wartime deaths on continental U.S. soil caused by enemy action. It was a tragedy shrouded in silence, as newspapers were forbidden from reporting the cause. To this day, a stone monument stands near the site, marking the eerie moment when World War II reached deep into small-town America. Despite this deadly success, Japan eventually abandoned the Fugo campaign. Most of the balloons failed to reach their targets, and American censors successfully suppressed the psychological impact. But in military archives and small-town memorials, the story lives on, a chilling reminder that the line between home front and battlefield is thinner than it seems. The Fugo project was an unlikely union of ancient materials and modern strategy, a ghostly weapon carried not by ships or planes, but by the wind. It is one of World War II's strangest and most haunting operations, made all the more disturbing by how close it came to changing history. The arrival of the first Fugo balloons on American soil was met with confusion, then alarm. In early January 1945, farmers, loggers, and children across Oregon and Northern California began reporting strange objects floating to the ground. Massive, sagging sheets of paper, steel rings, and odd metal parts. Some found unexploded bombs still attached. The military was immediately alerted, but investigators at first had no idea what they were looking at. The materials were foreign, the design unfamiliar, and there were no visible markings to indicate their origin. It wasn't until intelligence analysts began piecing together the high-altitude trajectory and comparing reports from across several states that the pattern emerged. These were deliberate enemy weapons, not weather balloons or debris. The U.S. government faced a difficult decision. On one hand, the Fugo campaign had proven that Japan could, in theory, deliver explosives directly onto American soil. The psychological impact alone could be devastating if the public found out. On the other hand, mass panic was precisely what Japan was hoping for. If newspapers ran the story, Japan might believe the campaign was working and launch thousands more. The solution? Silence. The War Department issued strict censorship orders to all media outlets. No photographs, no headlines, no mention of the balloons or any fires they may have caused. Even after fragments were sent to Washington for analysis, the public remained in the dark. The only ones who knew the truth were military command, field agents, and a handful of scientists working in secret labs. Meanwhile, out in the forests, danger still drifted down from above. Balloons continued to fall, sometimes days apart, sometimes several in 1 week. Some exploded on impact, others didn't. A few caused minor fires. One struck a power line and temporarily cut electricity to the Manhattan Project's Hanford site in Washington, a chilling reminder of how vulnerable key infrastructure could be. Army recovery teams were dispatched to retrieve remnants. Locals were quietly warned to avoid touching or reporting anything suspicious. But there was no coordinated public warning, no press releases, and no visible alerts. The Fugo campaign was becoming one of the best-kept secrets of the entire war, hidden in plain sight, floating silently across the sky. Back in Japan, military officials had no idea whether their balloons were working. There was no radio transmitter aboard the Fugo devices, no camera or tracking system. The entire plan depended on wind, hope, and the assumption that chaos would follow. When news of the WWII, Oregon explosion finally reached Japan months later via Swiss intermediaries, it was seen as confirmation that the campaign had worked. But by then, the war was nearly over. The Japanese had already diverted most of their industrial capacity to defending the homeland from a likely invasion. The Fugo campaign, like many of Japan's late war ideas, had failed to alter the tide. But it had succeeded in proving that the mainland United States was not untouchable. American military officials continued the cover-up even after the war ended. Most civilians who discovered balloon debris were never told what it really was. Reports were buried, photographs archived, and even now many of the recovery locations remain classified. Historians estimate that fewer than 20% of the launched balloons were ever recovered or reported. The rest are presumed to have burned up in the atmosphere, landed in the ocean, or simply vanished in remote wilderness. Some may still be out there, tangled in trees or buried under moss, a ghostly remnant of a forgotten front. In the decades since, the Fugo story has slowly emerged from classified documents into public awareness. Declassified reports, survivor accounts, and museum displays now tell the tale of Japan's strange sky-borne experiment. Schools near Bly, Oregon, teach the incident as part of local history. Researchers have even uncovered original launch sites and interviewed former builders of the balloons. But for decades, this entire campaign, the only successful enemy bombing of the U.S. mainland during World War II, remained unknown to the very country it targeted. It is a story of secrecy, strange science, and the silent weapons of war. Of the more than 9,000 Fugo balloons launched from Japan, the majority were never seen again. The Pacific Ocean is vast, unpredictable, and merciless to drifting objects. Winds shifted, storms tore balloons apart, and many likely fell into the sea without a trace. But others, perhaps hundreds, may have made landfall without detection. Sparse populations, remote forests, and the sheer scale of the American West provided perfect hiding grounds. Some landed in uninhabited mountain ranges. Others likely exploded upon descent, leaving only fragments that were buried by time, snow, or soil. Without a centralized tracking mechanism, both Japanese and American authorities were left guessing about the fate of most of the balloons. Incredibly, some Fugo remnants have continued to surface decades later. In 1955, a forestry crew in British Columbia stumbled upon rusted bomb fragments and an odd steel ring embedded in a tree, later confirmed to be part of a Fugo balloon. In 1962, a hiker in Wyoming found a weathered sandbag and rice paper strips tangled around a fallen log. Most astonishingly, in 1992, a team surveying for wildfires in Montana uncovered a near-intact Fugo ballast frame, prompting a full military investigation and controlled detonation of what was believed to be a live explosive. Each of these discoveries reignited curiosity and fear, reminders that parts of World War II still linger in the quiet corners of North America. The construction of these balloons made them both fragile and strangely resilient. While the rice paper panels easily tore, the metal fixtures and bombs were designed to withstand long-distance travel. The ballast system, composed of sandbags, timers, and fuses, often outlived the balloon's flight, surviving impact and decades of exposure. American bomb squads were trained to identify and disarm these components as late as 1947. Manuals were updated to include diagrams of the balloon mechanisms, even though most Americans had still never heard of the Fugo campaign. In effect, the war continued quietly, its weapons dormant, but not forgotten. Despite the government's silence, indigenous communities and rural residents sometimes pass down stories of the strange balloons. In parts of Oregon and British Columbia, tribal elders recalled tales of sky serpents that fell from the clouds or ghost bombs that made no sound until the earth shook. In some cases, children were warned not to touch certain metal parts found in the woods, warnings that would later prove life-saving. These oral histories, once dismissed as folklore, have gained renewed respect as archaeologists and historians link them to actual Fugo landings. The war, it seems, had left its mark long before documents confirmed the truth. The U.S. Forest Service, for its part, kept quiet watch for balloon-related fires and explosions well into the 1950s. Internal memos and surveillance reports documented dozens of suspicious blazes that matched the expected impact zones of the balloons. However, with no official acknowledgement, these were often written off as lightning strikes or accidents. Only later would researchers connect the timing and locations to the Fugo campaign. Even today, government records remain partially redacted. Questions linger. How many bombs were never found? Did some land in Mexico or Canada? Could any still be active? These uncertainties keep the Fugo legacy alive, a mystery buried under leaves, snow, and silence. The final tally of Fugo balloons remains elusive, and so does the full extent of their impact. They failed to ignite the panic Japan hoped for, but they did succeed in reaching their targets and leaving behind a lingering sense of vulnerability. Every unearthed fragment is a clue, every scarred tree a page in an unfinished chapter. As long as unexploded ordnance may still lie hidden in remote places, the Fugo campaign remains not just history, but an active presence in the land. And that, perhaps, is its most haunting success. The United States government, realizing the unusual nature of the Fugo threat, assembled a special task force of scientists, military analysts, and intelligence officers. Their goal, to understand the construction, function, and intent of these mysterious flying weapons. One of the key breakthroughs came when engineers at MIT and the Naval Research Laboratory reconstructed a recovered balloon and mapped out its expected path using atmospheric data. They concluded, with chilling accuracy, that these devices had been launched from Japan's eastern coastline and carried across the Pacific by the high-altitude jet stream, a weather system few had fully understood before. The implications were staggering. Japan had harnessed nature itself as a long-range delivery system. Despite the technical brilliance behind the balloons, their accuracy was non-existent. The Fugo bombs landed randomly across a massive area stretching from Alaska to Mexico. Their lack of control was both a limitation and a danger. No one could predict where they would fall, who they might kill, or what they might destroy. This unpredictability forced American authorities to treat the threat as a national security risk, especially since several balloons were suspected to have landed near critical infrastructure. Special alerts were quietly issued to nuclear sites, hydroelectric dams, oil refineries, and even Hollywood studios. If one bomb hit the wrong place, the psychological effect could far outweigh the physical damage. One of the more secretive operations launched in response was the distribution of classified field guides to police, fire departments, and forest rangers in the western states. These documents, stamped "restricted," contained diagrams, photos and instructions for handling balloon wreckage, reporting incidents, and securing possible unexploded ordnance. The guides emphasized discretion and silence. Personnel were told to remove any civilians from the area, confiscate cameras, and avoid discussing the events even with other officials. In effect, the U.S. created a shadow protocol for a shadow weapon, a wartime theater of silence and controlled panic. Meanwhile, military labs conducted controlled detonations of captured Fugo bombs in isolated test sites. Engineers studied the fragmentation patterns, examined the incendiary material, and evaluated the timers and ballast systems. These tests revealed just how ingeniously designed the devices were. The altimeters functioned with barometric precision. The sandbag drop system regulated altitude with surprising effectiveness, and the fire-starting chemicals were potent even in wet conditions. The bombs may not have had guidance systems, but their engineering was elegant in its simplicity. The fact that they could travel over 6,000 miles and still function made the entire campaign impossible to dismiss. By late spring of 1945, rumors had started to spread among civilians despite the blackout. Whispered stories of falling paper bombs, burned barns, and military cleanups circulated through logging towns and farming communities. Some local newspapers defied the censorship orders, printing vague accounts of enemy objects or unexplained explosions. The War Department responded harshly, seizing papers, threatening editors, and reiterating the blackout. But the public had already begun to piece together the truth. A growing unease settled over the western states, a quiet fear that danger might drift from the sky at any moment, unseen until it struck. In the end, the Fugo campaign's impact was psychological, not tactical. It failed to spark the wildfires Japan had hoped for. It failed to cause widespread casualties. But it succeeded in proving that no nation, not even the distant and mighty United States, was entirely beyond reach. It introduced a new kind of warfare, one that was silent, unpredictable, and atmospheric. And it forced America to consider what other unconventional threats might emerge as the war dragged on. In that sense, the balloons had done their job. They made the sky feel just a little more dangerous. On May 5, 1945, a quiet forest clearing in southern Oregon became the site of the only deadly enemy attack on the continental United States during World War II. Reverend Archie Mitchell and his pregnant wife Elsie were leading a Sunday school picnic for 5 local children near Gearhart Mountain, just outside the small town of WWII. As the children played among the pine trees, Elsie called out that she'd found something strange. It was a balloon, or what looked like the remains of one, tangled in a tree. Before anyone could stop her, she reached for it. A sudden explosion tore through the air. The blast killed Elsie instantly, along with all 5 children. Reverend Mitchell survived, the only witness to the worst-case scenario of the Fugo campaign. The tragedy in WWII was exactly the kind of incident U.S. officials had feared but had worked desperately to prevent by maintaining media silence. In this case, however, the scale of the loss and the civilian casualties made it impossible to conceal. Within hours, local authorities, clergy, and Army officials were on site. The area was cordoned off, debris collected, and the dead carefully documented. For the first time since the balloon campaign began, a press statement was authorized. On May 22, 1945, Over 2 weeks later, the War Department officially confirmed that a Japanese balloon bomb had killed 6 American civilians. But even in this rare admission, officials urged the press to avoid sensationalizing the story, lest Japan be encouraged to send more. The victims of the WWII explosion were Elsie Mitchell, aged 26, and 5 children, aged 11 to 14, Edward Engine, Jay Gifford, Joan Potsky, Dick Potsky, and Sherman Shoemaker. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery in Bly, where a stone monument now stands. The incident sent shockwaves through the local community and across the western United States. For the families of the victims, the silence that followed was especially painful. There was no national memorial, no government ceremony, and no official moment of mourning. Their story, like the campaign that killed them, was largely buried under the war's larger narrative. It would take decades before they were publicly acknowledged as the only U.S. civilians killed by enemy action on American soil during World War II. The Japanese had no way of knowing their balloon had caused deaths. The Fugo campaign had ended weeks earlier, with many of the final launches occurring in April 1945. As Japan braced for invasion, the military quietly closed the operation. Still, for those involved in launching the balloons, news of the WWII explosion, which reached Japan through neutral Swiss and Swedish channels, confirmed that their efforts had not been in vain. Some reports suggest that this revelation led to quiet celebration among hardline officers. Others say it prompted reflection and regret, especially among the schoolgirls who had helped build the balloons and now understood the consequences of their handiwork. In the years after the war, Reverend Mitchell spoke rarely about what he saw. He remarried, became a missionary in Ecuador, and was later kidnapped and presumed killed in 1962. His silence mirrored that of the nation, a refusal to fully confront the horror of what had happened in Bly. But locals never forgot. Each year on the anniversary of the explosion, townspeople gathered at the memorial to lay flowers and remember the lives lost. Over time, the story spread. Historians and journalists began to re-examine the Fugo campaign not as a strange footnote of war, but as a human tragedy, one that could have been prevented if not for the deliberate blackout. Today, the WWII incident is taught in some schools as a solemn reminder of how secrecy, even in wartime, can carry terrible costs. It is also seen as an eerie precursor to the kinds of asymmetric and psychological warfare that would dominate the Cold War and beyond. A bomb with no pilot, a weapon that kills without warning, and a war that touched even the most remote corners of a faraway land. The story of Bly is not just about balloons. It's about the invisible reach of conflict and the lives it can destroy in silence.
Though the Fugo campaign faded from wartime headlines, its long shadow never fully disappeared. For decades after the war, mysterious fires erupted in the deep forests of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, often with no lightning or human cause to explain them. In isolated cases, investigators quietly labeled the incidents as possible delayed ordnance, but the truth was rarely shared with the public. The idea that dormant weapons, released into the sky decades earlier, might still ignite tragedy didn't fit the post-war narrative of peace and control. Instead, the Fugo legacy became part of whispered lore, something known by rangers, bomb squads, and old veterans, but absent from textbooks. The technical ingenuity behind the balloons continued to attract military interest long after Japan's surrender. Analysts studying Cold War threats examined the Fugo model as a possible precursor to modern unmanned delivery systems. The very concept, a weapon carried by atmospheric currents, needing no pilot, traveling silently, foreshadowed the logic of ICBMs and drone warfare. Declassified documents from the 1960s reveal that U.S. strategists studied the Fugo program while considering high-altitude surveillance balloons and atmospheric testing. In a twist of irony, the very system once used to deliver fire to America would inspire some of its most advanced aerospace programs. In Japan, the Fugo campaign remains a point of quiet historical discomfort. The balloons were built by schoolgirls and civilians, many of whom had no idea they were constructing weapons. Some believed they were helping with weather research. Only decades later did they discover the truth, that their hands had shaped instruments of war, and in at least one case, death. Interviews with elderly women who worked on the Fugo balloons reveal a deep mix of regret and detachment. Some mourn the lives lost in Oregon. Others remain patriotic, insisting they simply did what was asked of them during a time of national desperation. The legacy in Japan is not guilt, it is ambiguity. In the United States, public awareness of the Fugo campaign has only recently begun to grow. Museums in Oregon and California have opened exhibits showcasing recovered balloon parts, government memos, and survivor testimonies. History teachers have begun to include the campaign in their World War II units, not as an oddity, but as a serious and sobering episode of homeland vulnerability. Documentaries, podcasts, and books have helped rekindle interest. The story resonates more now, in an age of cyber attacks and invisible threats, than it did in the 1940s. The Fugo balloons were not merely relics of the past, they were early signals of the new kind of warfare that defines the 21st century. For the families in Bly, the legacy remains deeply personal. Every May 5th, they gather at the stone monument to lay flowers and tell the story again. It's a ritual of remembrance, but also of warning. The silence that allowed the tragedy to happen is no longer accepted. School children in the region now learn about the event, and their essays and drawings are posted on the walls of local libraries and historical centers. In this way, the Fugo campaign has transitioned from secret to symbol, from buried danger to living memory. The unonce suppressed story now serves to educate, protect, and honor. Ultimately, the legacy of the Fugo balloons is one of contradiction. It is a story of brilliant engineering used in a desperate act. A tale of weapons that mostly failed, but in one place succeeded too well. A campaign that was forgotten by history, yet still echoes in the trees, the soil, and in the minds of those who listened to them. The Fugo bombs were carried by the wind, but their impact was far from aimless. They drifted across oceans and decades, igniting fire not only in forests, but in the minds of those who now remember them.